Welcome back, and thank you for joining me for episode 2 of Let's Talk About It, a social work podcast, where this season we're exploring the experiences of Black veterans within the VA system. In episode 1, we identified the problem, and we spoke about the gaps and how this podcast will try to fill those gaps. In this episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the history of racism within the United States and how that carries over and affects Black veterans today as they navigate the institutions around them, including the Veterans Affairs. So stay tuned and thank you for joining me. Let's begin at the beginning. Because if we're going to talk about mistrust, if we're going to talk about why Black veterans sometimes hesitate before walking into a VA facility, or why they might feel guarded when speaking with a provider, we need to understand that this mistrust is not new. It's not born in the present. It is a story with centuries of roots. Racism in the United States has always been structural. Muhammad in 2010 explains that race wasn't simply a social attitude. It was built directly into American law and economics. Alexander in 2010 also adds that whenever one racial caste system has ended, another has taken its place. So from the very beginning, racism wasn't accidental. It was policy, it was law, it was design. And when emancipation came in 1865, freedom was offered without repair. Fonner in 1988 shows that the years after the Civil War were a time of enormous possibility. Black Americans were opening schools, they were holding office, and building communities. But those gains were violently dismantled. Wickerson in 2020 describes how white backlash from terrorist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and restrictive black codes closed the door on those opportunities. What could have been a turning point in American equality became the foundation for Jim Crow laws that dictated life for nearly a century. Under Jim Crow, Black families were systematically locked out of opportunities. Anderson in 1988 documents how schools for Black children were deliberately underfunded and overcrowded. Yearby in 2022 shows that Black communities were excluded from hospitals or forced into segregated wards with fewer resources. And Muhammad points out that law enforcement practices criminalize Blackness itself, ensuring that policing and punishment fell disproportionately on Black neighborhoods. This wasn't about bad apples, it was about systems working as designed. The military mirrored these injustices. Black men and women fought in every American war. They served in the Revolution, in the Civil War, in World War I, and World War II, and so on. Yet their service was systematically undervalued. Gasman in 2011 shows that even during World War II, segregation within the armed forces limited promotions and access to resources for Black service members. Service was rendered, but equal honor and reward were not. And when the war ended, those inequities carried forward into post-war policy. The GI Bill of 1944 is a powerful example of this. It was hailed as transformative, a law that would send veterans to college, finance homes, and support their transition to civilian life. For many white veterans, it did just that. They bought homes in the suburbs, they earned degrees, and built wealth. But Yearby et al. In 2022 explained how Black veterans were systematically excluded. Banks refused mortgages, colleges denied admissions, Local VA offices diverted resources away from black veterans. Katz Nelson, 2005, shows how the GI Bill became a gateway for the middle class for white veterans while black veterans were left behind. Housing policy reinforced these exclusions. The federal government's practice of redlining, literally coloring maps to mark black neighborhoods as too risky for investment, ensured that black families could not buy in desirable areas. Braverman et al. In 2022 explained how these neighborhood conditions, like limited access to healthy food, safe parks, quality schools, and healthcare, produced long-term health disparities. Structural racism here wasn't just about access to doctors, it was about shaping the environments where people lived and raised their families. Healthcare itself told a similar story. Hospitals were segregated, often under-resourced when serving black communities. And even when black patients gained access, racial bias shaped treatment decisions. A chilling example is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Reverby conducted an analysis in 2009 that details how from 1932 to 1972, government doctors withheld treatment for black men with syphilis, even after penicillin became the proven cure. The U.S. Public Health Service didn't treat them, it watched them die, all in the name of, quote, research. Tuskegee is not ancient history. It ended in 1972, within living memory for many black veterans and their families. And Reverby points out the betrayal extended beyond those directly enrolled. It spread through black communities, confirming what many already knew. Government health institutions did not value their lives equally. That mistrust was not paranoia, it was entirely rational. So when we ask why black veterans today may hesitate to seek care, or why they sometimes disengage from services, we must remember this context. They carry their own experiences, yes, but also the collective memory of slavery, the Reconstruction's betrayal, of Jim Crow segregation and exclusion from the GI Bill, and of redlining, of the Tuskegee, and of decades of broken promises. Think of it this way. When a white veteran enters the VA, they might see a flawed but service-oriented system. When a black veteran enters, they may see the extension of the same government that enslaved their ancestors, segregated their neighborhoods, denied them mortgages, and experimented on their bodies without consent. That's not just perception. It's a pattern and their lived reality. And the research backed this up. Bailey in 2021 said plainly, racist policies are the root cause of health inequalities in America. Braverman et al. In 2022 explained that structural racism damages health not only through direct denial of care, but by embedding inequalities into every condition of life. And Scott Jones et al. In 2020 showed that structural racism inflicts trauma that accumulates over time, eroding both health and trust. So here's the key point. We cannot ignore this history. If we only look at a single VA exam room, mistrust may look like an overreaction. But when we see the longer arc, mistrust becomes what it truly is: a rational, protective stance, a survival strategy, the product of centuries of racial harm. So, as we move into the next segment, let's hold on to this truth. History is not behind us. It walks into the VA with every black veteran, and every interaction is filtered through that lens. Now that we've traced the long history of racism in the United States, we need to ask, how do we describe what we're actually looking at today? What do we mean when we say structural racism? This isn't just a buzzword or an abstract theory. Structural racism is a term scholars use to explain how racism isn't only about individual prejudice. It's about how systems, rules, and everyday practices keep producing inequality, even when no one person is standing up and saying, I'm going to be racist right now. Williams et al. In 2019 wrote that structural racism works through what he called the totality of ways in which societies foster racial discrimination through housing, education, employment, healthcare, and even the criminal justice system. In other words, it's baked into the structure of our society. Oleg et al. In 2017 argue that structural racism is best understood as interlocking systems. Think of it like gears in a machine. Housing policy connects to education policy, education connects to employment, employment connects to health insurance and income, and health connects back to where you can live. If every gear is tilted against you, then even if one turns in your favor, the whole system still keeps reproducing inequality. More recently, in 2022, Bailey et al. Wrote that racist policies are root causes of health inequities. Her and her colleagues gave the example of redlining. The federal government literally marking black neighborhoods as risky for investment. That wasn't just a housing issue. It limited wealth accumulation, shaped schools, and concentrated environmental hazards into black neighborhoods. Bailey's point is clear. These aren't separate issues. They are all connected. And that's important for veterans because black veterans don't just enter the VA as individuals. They carry with them the cumulative effects of structural racism in housing, education, employment, and healthcare. For example, research by Yerby et al. In 2022 shows how health policies historically excluded black Americans from access to hospitals and benefits. Those exclusions set the stage for mistrust that still echoes in the VA today. Scott Jones et al. In 2020 take it a step further. They explain that structural racism doesn't just limit opportunities, it causes trauma. Repeated exposure to discrimination creates stress responses in the body. Higher blood pressure, higher cortisol, and worse mental health. When that trauma accumulates across generations, it shows up as both mistrust and health disparities. We can see this in real time with black veterans. A 2023 study by Nilny et al. Found that everyday discrimination explained much of the gap in PTSD and depression between black women veterans and their white counterparts. Think about that. Two people can be exposed to trauma in service, but the ongoing stress of discrimination after service adds another layer of harm. That is structural racism at work. Now, some people hear structural and think it means nobody is personally responsible, but that's not true. Crenshaw in 1989 argued when she coined the term intersectionality that structures are made of choices, policies, and priorities. They don't appear out of thin air. Crenshaw's point was that when we only look at individuals, we miss how those systems are designed and reinforced. And when you miss that, you miss the whole story. Dean and colleagues in 2022 wrote that structural racism is best understood as a system of power that normalizes and legitimizes an array of dynamics. That's academic language, but what it means is this: structures don't just exist, they're legitimized. They're made to look normal. For example, if a VA disability claims process produces lower approval rates for black veterans, and no one investigates why, the structure itself becomes the excuse. Oh, that's just how the system works. But that normal system is reproducing inequity. Another good example comes from employment. Darity et al. In 2018 discovered that black workers with the same qualifications still face higher unemployment and lower wages than white workers. When a black veteran leaves the military and re-enters a civilian labor force, they face not just the challenges of transition, but also the structural realities of racially unequal job markets. That in turn affects whether they need more support from the VA, whether they can afford supplemental insurance, and whether they experience stress that compounds existing health conditions. So why does this matter for our conversation today? Because when a black veteran interacts with the VA, that encounter isn't happening in isolation. It's happening after years of living in a world where every gear in the machine has been tilted against them. Education was underfunded. Housing was segregated. Employment was unequal. Healthcare was biased. Criminal justice was disproportionate. Each system feeds into the next. And by the time a veteran arrives at the VA, mistrust is not only understandable, it's inevitable. Jones, writing in the American Journal of Public Health in 2000, used a metaphor of two flower boxes. One had rich soil, the other had rocky, depleted soil. Seeds planted in the fertile box thrived. Seeds planted in the poor soil struggled. Over time, the difference looked natural. But in fact, it was structural. The soil determined the outcome. For Black veterans, the soil they've been planted in, shaped by centuries of racist policy, make their health and their relationship with the VA fundamentally different. And here's the part we can't forget. Mistrust is not irrational. It's rational. It's a protective response. As Bailey et al. Wrote in 2021, racist policies have been the root cause of health inequities for generations. And Braverman and colleagues wrote in 2022 that those inequities are embedded into daily life. And as Scott Jones et al. Explained in 2020, the trauma of structural racism shows up in both health outcomes and relationships with institutions. Put simply, mistrust makes sense. So, when we hear that some Black veterans avoid VA care, or disengage from mental health services, or feel guarded in disability exams, we shouldn't ask, what's wrong with them? We should ask, what's wrong with the structure? That's why in the next segment, we're going to look closely at what happens inside the VA itself. We'll move from defining structural racism to exploring how Black veterans describe it in their daily experiences of care, of claims, and of outcomes. So far, we've talked about history and about structures. But what does this look like inside the VA today? What are Black veterans actually experiencing in their day-to-day interactions with the system? Let's start with encounters in primary care. In 2020, Houston et al. Conducted a study looking at veterans with chronic pain. They found that Black veterans reported significantly more perceived discrimination than white veterans. Black veterans described doctors giving shorter explanations, making less eye contact, and showing less respect. Think about how that lands. When you're in pain, when you're seeking help, and the person you're supposed to trust gives you less attention and less respect, that's not just an unpleasant visit. It erodes your trust in the entire system. Mental health care tells a similar story. In 2020, Ellison et al. Published a study about Black veterans' perceptions of racial bias in VA mental health care. Veterans described disengaging from therapy after feeling stereotyped or dismissed. They left because the very place that was supposed to help them felt unsafe. That's structural racism at the level of lived experience. This is the data that quantitative studies don't tell us. The why. And this isn't just about one-off encounters. Lee et al. In 2024 conducted a free listing study asking Black veterans what health equity looked like to them in the VA. Many of them said they actively avoided racial conflict in clinical settings. But avoiding conflict doesn't mean trust. It means carrying the emotional burden of protecting yourself in spaces that are supposed to heal you. We see the same themes in specialty care. In 2022, Jenkins et al. Did a study about Black veterans with chronic kidney disease. These veterans described racism in the VA as part of their daily reality. They talked about subtle dismissals, about assumptions made by providers, and about the exhaustion of having to advocate for themselves in every single appointment. And then there's the mental health distress linked to systemic racism. In 2024, Whelan et al. Conducted a longitudinal study following Black veterans over 2 years. Nearly 80% of those veterans reported distress specifically tied to systemic racism. This wasn't just about trauma from combat. It was about trauma from navigating the very system designed to care for them. I'm going to take a second to have you all reflect on that. The repeated theme of the system that is designed to care for them causing trauma. Another study showed how discrimination directly impacts mental health outcomes. In 2023, Nilny et al. Published an article about everyday discrimination that is explained by racial disparities in PTSD and depression among women veterans. In other words, the mental health gap wasn't only about military trauma. It was also about the ongoing experience of being dismissed, overlooked, or stereotyped in healthcare. And this problem just isn't in care. It's in the benefit system as well. In 2020, Red et al. Published a study about racial disparities and disability claims for PTSD, which we talked about back in episode 1. They found that Black veterans were less likely than white veterans to be awarded benefits, even when symptom severity was higher. Again, in 2023, the Government Accountability Office released a report confirming those disparities, but across multiple common conditions. So it wasn't just secluded to PTSD. This was across multiple common conditions where Black veterans were consistently denied at a higher rate than their white peers and compared to any other group. The GAO called for better data and deeper investigation, but the message was already clear. The claims process is not race neutral. Even when Black veterans do get into treatment, outcomes are not equal. In 2021, Gross et al. Conducted a study about racial disparities in a VA residential PTSD treatment group. They found that Black veterans made smaller gains than white veterans and had higher rates of depression reoccurrence after a 6-month follow-up. The program was the same for both. The structure was the same, but the outcomes were different. That tells us the program was not designed with Black veterans in mind. So, what do we see when we put these studies together across health, mental health, benefits, care? We see a pattern. Black veterans are more likely to feel disrespected in appointments, more likely to disengage from mental health care, more likely to carry the burden of protecting themselves in clinical settings, more likely to describe racism as part of their daily reality, more likely to report distress tied to systemic racism, less likely to receive disability benefits, and when they do receive care, less likely to experience the same treatment gains as their white peers. This is why mistrust is not irrational. It is not paranoia. It is grounded in daily experience, confirmed by study after study after study after study. Huseman et al. 2020, Elason et al. 2020, Jakins et al. 2022, Lee et al. 2024, Whalen et al. 2024, Nilny et al. 2023, Red et al. 2020, the GAO in 2023, Gross et al. in 2021. All of these studies within the last 5 years. These are not anecdotes. They are peer-reviewed research findings, and together they paint a very consistent picture. The VA is not serving Black veterans equally. And this reality takes a toll. When a veteran has to walk into everyday appointments wondering, will I be taken seriously this time? Will I be treated with respect this time? That's a burden on top of whatever health conditions they already carry. It's another layer of stress. It's another wound. It's another reason to mistrust. This brings us to the next part of the conversation. We've looked at history, we've defined structure, and we've named the daily experiences of Black veterans inside the VA. Now we need to ask, how does history live in the room? How do past betrayals like Tuskegee echo in the present day exam room, shaping how every decision and every interaction is experienced? And that's where we're going to turn to next. We've talked about history, we've defined structures, we've looked at daily experiences in the VA. Now let's bring these together and ask, how does history show up in the room with a Black veteran today? One of the clearest examples is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Revry in 2009 wrote that from 1932 to 1972, hundreds of black men were deceived by government doctors. They were told they were being treated, but they were not. They were receiving placebos. And this was even after penicillin became a cure. Treatment was then withheld. Families were devastated. Communities were traumatized. And as Reverby explained, the damage wasn't only to those men. It was to the collective trust of black communities towards government healthcare. Tuskegee became a symbol, a story passed down, proof that the government could not be trusted with black lives. That legacy lives on. When a black veteran sits in a VA exam room and feels dismissed, it doesn't feel like just a bad appointment. It feels like Tuskegee. It feels like the GI Bill denials. It feels like Reconstruction's betrayal and Jim Crow's exclusions. This is what Fagan described in 2010 with every new act of discrimination is filtered through centuries of remembered injustice. The VA, of course, is not the same as Tuskegee, but the VA is part of the US government. And as Yearby argued in 2022, government institutions cannot separate themselves from their own history. Black veterans don't enter those spaces as blank slates. They enter carrying memory, and memory shapes trust. In 1991, William Cross developed the Niagara model of racial identity, and it stated that identity development for Black Americans includes stages of recognizing collective history. That recognition affects how people see institutions. For a Black veteran who knows that their grandfather was denied a GI Bill loan in 1946, or whose grandmother talked about the Tuskegee study, walking into a VA hospital is not just a personal experience. It's a historical one. And here's where structural trauma comes in. Shim et al. In 2014 stated that structural racism produces what they call structural trauma, harm that is transmitted across generations, not only through memory but through material conditions. Poverty, housing, health disparities, all compounded. That trauma doesn't stay in the past. It shows up in the body and in the mind of today's veterans. When a Black veteran says, "I don't trust the VA," they are not only speaking for themselves. They are speaking from a lineage of broken promises, from slavery, from Reconstruction, from Jim Crow, from Tuskegee, from decades of systemic bias documented in studies like Huesman et al. In 2020 or Nilnes in 2023. And this is why trust is so fragile. Giddens in 1990 argued that trust is not just given, it is earned continuously. Every interaction is a test. For veterans, every appointment, every disability exam, every claim decision is one more test of whether this government will finally treat them fairly. If the VA succeeds, trust can grow. But if the VA fails, it doesn't just feel like one mistake. It feels like history repeating. And when history repeats, mistrust deepens. This is why we cannot ignore history. It is not an academic exercise. It is not a side note. It is the key to understanding mistrust today. Black veterans are not disengaging because of misunderstanding. They are disengaging because of experience, both personal and collective. So, as we close this segment, let's be clear. When we see mistrust, we are not seeing irrationality. We are seeing survival. When we see disengagement, we are not seeing apathy. We are seeing protection. And when we see anger, we are not seeing hostility. We are seeing the weight of history in the room. In episode 1, we named the problem. We said clearly, Black veterans experience worse outcomes in the VA, from care to benefits to mental health. We explained how critical race theory helps us see that racism is not an accident. It's ordinary unless actively dismantled. In this episode, we traced the roots. We looked at slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, the GI Bill, redlining, and Tuskegee. We heard from historians like Eric Foner in 1988, Isabel Wilkerson in 2020, and Susan Reverby in 2009. We learned from health scholars like Zinzi Bailey in 2021, Paula Braveman in 2022, and Raja Yerbi in 2022. We connected those histories to present-day experiences documented by researchers like Leslie Huseman in 2020, Jerome Elysian in 2020, Karen Jenkins in 2022, Nadine Lee in 2024, Jacqueline Whelan in 2024, and Yvette Nalini in 2023. And we saw the pattern. Mistrust is not irrational. It is the rational outcome of centuries of betrayal, documented in both history books and peer-reviewed journals. So as we look forward to episode 3, we'll continue to dive deeper and deeper into the mechanisms that keep the gears of inequity moving for Black veterans. We will break down each area where Black veterans feel dismissed, unseen, and unheard. We will start this journey in the exploration of healthcare experiences and outcomes within the VA and tie how they mirror the same experiences outside the VA. We will discuss what the VA and its providers and leaders can do differently to correct the gear of healthcare. Naming harm is only the first step. Understanding history is only the second step. The real work and the real hope lies in building systems that heal. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Just listening to this podcast, you are engaging in the change process by hearing their story. The first step to change is to see the problem and then understand it. Reflect on what you've heard here today. Apply it to your own experiences and reframe your understanding. Remember, if you got anything out of today's discussion, please share it with a battle buddy, a colleague, or someone you feel needs to hear this. Like, follow, share, and I'll see you in the next episode.